And welcome back to Lens on Africa. The U.S. Africa Leadership Summit is our subject for conversation. But to put that conversation in proper perspective, here is a little backgrounder.
My administration's engagement with Africa and the priority we place on these relationships began on day one. Because when Africa succeeds, the United States succeeds. Quite frankly, the whole world succeeds as well.
The U.S. Africa Business Forum, attended by President Muhammadu Buhari and dozens of other heads of state and government, has as its theme, Partnering for a Prosperous and Resilient Future. It is aimed at advancing two-way trade and investment partnerships that bolster Africa's role in the global economy, scale innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as drive advancements in critical economic sectors.
Together, we want to build a future of opportunity where no one is left behind. Today, I'm announcing that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation is investing nearly $370 million in new projects, $100 million to increase the reliable, clean energy for millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, $20 million to provide financing for fertilizer to help smallholder farmers, particularly women farmers, increase the yields of their crops, $10 million to support small and medium-sized enterprises that help bring clean drinking water to communities all across the continent.
Africa's economic transition, President Biden said, depends largely on good governance, healthy populations, and reliable as well as affordable energy. And the United States is committed to supporting every aspect of inclusive growth on the continent.
The United States is signing a historic memorandum of understanding with the new African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. This MOU will unlock new opportunities for trade and investment between our countries and bring Africa and the United States even closer than ever. This is an enormous opportunity for Africa's future, and the United States wants to help make those opportunities real. 1.3 billion people and a continent-wide market totaling $3.4 trillion.
During the forum, attended by business leaders from across the United States and Africa, several deals were signed as a concrete proof of an enduring commitment towards cementing new kind of partnerships between the United States and Africa that will spur shared success.
I think the U.S.'s focus has been on moving the relationship with the continent from one of aid to one of trade, and then moving from trade to investment. And today they announced a $300 billion commitment via the IDC, which has been restructured, and now they want to make equity investments across the world with a big focus on Africa because of the opportunities. I think that we must commend our president, President Muhammadu Buhari, who has led a solid initiative to project the country on the international stage, and that's a big plus. And I think with initiatives of this nature, when the commitments the U.S. is making materialize into actual investments into the continent, Nigeria will get a large share of those investments. Afrexim today signed a $500 million commitment. African Finance Corporation, which is also Nigeria-based, also signed a $500 million commitment. So at least, when it's not just a talk show, people are walking away from here with bankable documents in their hands, and we are looking forward to the deployment of these funds.
The U.S. Africa Leaders Summit continues. From Washington, D.C., Adamu Sambo, NTA News.
Explore this conversation, we have in the studio with us an international analyst on education, law, diplomacy, international relations, economic security, sociology, and history. Barrister Dr. Mainasara Kogo Umar. It's good to have you in the studio.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Welcome to Lens on Africa, and I'm going to ask this question.
Yes.
What is the U.S. Africa Summit and Leadership Summit, and why should we really care about it?
Well, the summary of it has been encapsulated in the address by President Biden.
Yeah.
In other words, the summary of it is partnership.
Yeah.
Partnership with a condition. In his address, he laid condition. The condition is good governance. partnership for good governance. All such money he pronounced, the investments drive and the need for them to come and assist Africa is predicated upon the willingness of African nations to entrench good governance.
Okay.
And good governance must be predicated upon democracy. As President Muhammadu Buhari, I must commend him in his resilience there. He talked about investments in Africa, investments in Africa, investments in Africa, talking about Africa in the collective sense. But the problem is, when you are talking about Africa as a bloc,
yes,
there are internal, very, very diametrical differences within the African countries that will thwart the ability of a common man to be able to drive the benefits of such international surgeon.
Now, specifically, one of the reasons, now that you've raised that up,
Yes.
I was going to ask, no nation in the world, international diplomacy, negotiates to a point of weakness for itself. It always negotiates for its own benefit.
Yes. The spirit behind every international initiative is protection of national interest,
Yes.
national sovereignty, and national heritage.
Yes.
In Nigeria, under sections 1, 2, 14.1, 14.2, and section 19A to D of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, our foreign policy drive has been entrenched there. But the central focus of it is that Africa is being seen as the mirror or the face of the continent. In other words, Nigeria is being seen as the mirror or the face of the continent. So Nigeria has a pivotal role to play in trying to see the actualization of all the agreements that will be reached at the end of this summit. Principally speaking, when you talk about it in the Constitution of Nigeria under Section 12, whatever agreements are reached there, they must be returned back and be domesticated in the country by the National Assembly. You must have the majority of it to become the law of the nation. The same thing with all other member nations. So I expect the African Union to be championed by Nigeria to be able to set up some bilateral and diplomatic committees that will be able to follow up this summit, not to leave the summit like that, but to see to the possibility of the entrenchment of the values of this summit, so that we will be able to see them in the practical sense. Otherwise, the intricate diplomatic type of conditionalities that will be attached to the dividends of this kind of summits will thwart the possibility of us having the dividends. And
I was going to ask, because I'm not impressed, easily impressed, because we usually have all these international summits and meetings, Japan, Africa, Japan, China, Africa, Europe, Africa, UK, Africa. We have all this kind of summits. And for me, the question is what comes out of it at the end of the day. I'm concerned about the negotiators that go there, the businessmen who are interested in their own empires, the level,
foundationally speaking, the basis for it has been weakened. In other words, the pivotal upon which we will be able to benefit from those things have been weakened. For example, it is an affront to sovereignty of the nations in Africa, individually and plurally, for a nation to call the whole of them and say U.S. Africa Summit, China Africa Summit. As tiny as Japan is even calling for Japan Africa Summit, instead of thinking from the angle of the international doctrine of sovereignty for each nation, to call the nation based on its own peculiarity, to be able to discuss with it diplomatically and have such a bilateral and even at the level of multilateral agreements, to have such accords on some areas of specific desire, of specific needs of the nation. For example,
to add with that, if, for example, countries like Japan are calling for Japan Africa Summit, you look at the size of the country and the continent, and you're really wondering now. And if you're having, for example, a UK Africa Summit, it's also a worrisome.
And I've never heard of Nigeria Asia Summit.
it doesn't
Nigeria
happen.
Caribbean
What
Summit.
does this say about the perception of Africa, and what does this say about our reality and what we need to do to be treated as equals?
That is the contemporary new colonialism that is going on. The central point of African leadership regarding international discourse should be the need for equal treatment of nations as sovereign nations. In other words, each country should be treated on its own independent palace. In other words, they should try as much as possible to really consider each of the African continents on its own independent peculiarity type of national structure. It has political structure, the economic problems, the social problems, the international type of diplomatic system it is having with different parts of the world. Especially when you are talking about, when you look at the continent of Africa, greater part of West Africa has its Afro strings on France. Central Africa has its Afro strings on Britain and Germany, for example. East Africa has Afro strings in Arab world and Russia and the rest. So you cannot unify and talk about Africa as a bloc without Africa having some problems. And that is the reason why even in Africa, you see the difficulty for Africa to be integrated as one. So long Africa doesn't think of economic integration, so long Africa doesn't think of uniformity of political system, so long Africa doesn't think of the heritages of our history, culture, costumes, and character, so long Africa is not thinking about the independence in political determination, so long Africa is not prepared to evolve an ideology, drive in our own system of living and developmental tempo. Africa, I will advocate that should really begin to think of South-South cooperation of relationship, or relationship with G20 countries, or relationship with those countries within the third world that have
not
really
with individual countries.
Exactly. There are countries, for example, if you talk about India, if you talk about Brazil, if you talk about Pakistan, if you talk about Australia, if you think about Korea, all these countries can come at the level of individual African countries' relationship with them. We will benefit more rather than taking ourselves without, first of all, thinking of agenda from the home.
I'm going to push more a little about the individual African countries,
Yes.
especially countries like Nigeria and others.
Yes.
Japan wasn't always seen at the same level as the rest of the world.
Yes.
And the Western countries did not take it as an equal at some point in time. It had to prove its mettle.
Yes.
It had to look in forward, develop itself, develop its market,
Yes.
build a culture of excellence, discipline, and respect. And by that, they were able to transform. They've always been productive, transform themselves into a world power.
Yes.
What can Africa do? I'm tired of looking out. I'm tired of blaming other people. We already know that other countries will come out and look out for themselves. So what can we do in the next 10 years, in the next 5 years? The world is changing very, very rapidly. I'm sure we will not recognize the world order in another 5 years. It will be completely different. What can we do as countries to get to the point where we are respected and we can be taken seriously as an individual, full-fledged countries when we come to the table, instead of this kind of situation where one country is summoning the whole African country and the whole African continent as though we're a bunch of children and called by an uncle or an older person?
Fundamentally speaking, we should be able to integrate our economy.
Okay.
The diamonds, the rich mineral resources in Central and East Africa, the rich mineral resources in West Africa, the rich endowments in our own seaways, all those things should be integrated into Africa, should be integrated into United African country. That is what. The one uniform political system, uniform type of currencies, one central bank for Africa, one integrated armed forces for Africa, one foreign relations.
It's a bit counter what I'm talking about. We're talking about, first of all, before we come together as one unified country, a continent that we know, one currency and all of that, which is they're working on with the AU and all.
Yes.
What do we need to do as individual African countries to be respected
President Biden has said it.
And treated as fellow first world countries? Forget the issue of good governance. They are telling you to have good government so that you'll be development. Japan didn't do that. Japan moved itself forward in economy, in productivity. It became a country that was independent in quality shots that the West depended on for more than just raw materials. Why are we not there yet? And what do we need to do to get to that point? Before you answer that question, we have a second report we need to take. And when we take that report, we'll write back and pick up where we finished.
Okay.
With the theme, Building Our Green Future Together, the session attended by African and U.S. leaders as well as key stakeholders provided a forum for showcasing shared efforts towards conserving and restoring Africa's ecosystems as well as rich natural resources. Discussions also centered on diversifying the continent's energy matrix, realizing energy security goals, and building sustainable supply chains.
Africa will be at the center of the clean energy transition. Its renewable energy potential is second to none. It's home to roughly a third of all critical minerals essential to the technology that will power the clean energy economy. But with nearly half of sub-Saharan Africa's population lacking reliable access to electricity, and the population set to grow to more than 2 billion people by 2050, how that transition is made will be decisive in shaping our future climate. The United States will work closely with African countries as they determine how best to meet their specific energy needs.
President Muhammadu Buhari, who addressed participants at the closed session, takes pride in the fact that Nigeria is the first African country to develop a detailed energy transition plan towards tackling both energy poverty and climate change, as well as delivering net zero emissions by 2060. Already, he said, the country has embarked on several reforms and unveiled impactful projects aimed at generating 30 gigawatts of electricity by 2030, with renewable energy contributing 30% of the energy mix. Delivering the energy transition plan, the president said, requires $1.9 trillion spending up to 2060, which translates to $10 billion per annum. He therefore made a case for Nigeria to be included in the G7 Climate Partnership List for the co-creation of just energy transition. President Buhari also seeks the support of the United States for Nigeria's full participation in the global carbon markets, as well as developing innovative business models and integrating renewables efficiently into the national grid. This, the president said, is a time like none other to unlock the development potentials of Nigeria and transform the lives of millions of people by tapping into the potential returns in the yet-to-be fully optimized Nigeria's enormous market. From Washington, D.C., Adamu Sambu, NTA News.
And welcome back. So my guest has been Dr. Mainasara, and before we go into that report, let's just pick up where we left off.
Yes, for Africa, Nigeria in particular, as a model to other countries, for it to reach such a level, we must get the basics right.
Yes.
The fundamental basic number one is that we must have national stability.
Yes.
Nobody will be prepared to come and invest in a country ravaged with insecurity.
Yes.
That is one. Number two, we must be prepared to lead. We should have leaders that are prepared, that knows the definition of leadership. In other words, we should avoid corruption. We have been leveled as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, despite the fact that Section 15, subsection 5 of the Constitution predicates that every public officer, every governmental officer must fight all forms of corrupt practices and abuse of office. So we must fight corruption. We must be prepared to fight corruption. We should fight insecurity for Nigeria to be secured. We should secondly fight corruption so that we institutionalize. We go beyond the ICPC, EFCC. We should set up anti-corruption court so that it will be a model, so that we'll be seeing people penalized. People that are in the government should be able to come and face accusations before the courts and then clean themselves or face prosecution. Then apart from that, we should try as much as possible to unify the country socially, so that everybody should believe in Nigeria, should subscribe to Nigeria, should put Nigeria over and above any other paramodial consideration in tandem with the provisions of sections 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 21, and 23.
You're talking about a lot of laws. There are a lot of laws. Laws are beautiful things. Laws are good things.
No, the character.
But we need to practice. Now, I'm just going to ask now to all our viewers there, please join the conversation on our WhatsApp number, on various social media handles. Send us your questions, your comments, your perspective on this issue, so you can join the conversation and we can let you in. So back to the video we just watched before we came here. It's clear that the U.S. interest is renewable energy. It wants to move from fossil fuels to renewable energies, and it says a third of most of the natural resources are here in Africa. So his agenda. My concern is, once again, after the first set of colonization, the U.S., the West, is setting the tone for our conversation. Africa, Nigeria, is not leading that conversation. We seem to be following, and we seem to be content because we're getting billions of dollars, or promised billions of dollars in investment. We are not in charge of this conversation.
No, not that we are not in charge. Africa has been making giant strides at the level of the Millennium Development Goal and Sustainable
Again, the Millennium Development Goals
was
designed by the UN. It was not an African idea sold to the world. It's a world idea brought down to Africa. We are not having our ideas, like I said, in this particular instance.
Domestically speaking, we have tried by setting up Federal Ministry of Environment, which was hitherto not there. And then concerted efforts are being made by the president, talking about, the rebuilding or the revamping of Lake Chad region, for example. Lake Chad bases, remember, long many years ago, the entirety of Borno State, the entirety of Yobe State, parts of Jigawa State, Kano and Katsina State, we used to be part of Lake Chad Basin. But now there is an effort to really inject more power into it. Then secondly, there is this Great Green Wall, which Nigeria is championing. Apart from Great Green Wall, Nigeria is championing the campaign for deforestation, so that people will now imbibe the spirit of planting trees. People will imbibe the culture of taking technological means of cooking and other means of energy rather than using firewoods and other things.
Absolutely. Nigeria has been doing quite a bit in the area of environment. We're making strides. We're pushing. We're trying to make things happen. Our President Muhammadu Buhari has not hidden away from the pack and has made it as one of his major agenda, the reviving of the Lake Chad region. But my question isn't that. My question is that we've gone to this international media and we're having this conversation. The U.S. has not hidden what its position is and why it is doing what it is doing. And we are happy. Like I said, we are not leading the conversation. We're having a conversation again in another pivotal time in the global history where Africa is not leading. We seem to be happy to receive the billions of dollars that they are offering in exchange for our doing what they say. Now, there is nothing wrong with environment, but my concern is once again in global affairs, African ideas are not at the heart and center. It is another attempt. It looks like, from what has been clearly said, our interest is simply African resources, not African ideology.
Of course, African ideology will never be taken seriously when Africans are going to international fora without any predetermined agenda. African countries, all of them rush to United States on the invitation of President Biden without internally sitting down to really coherently organize and evolve ideas and programs and agenda which they will advance. But
precisely,
this is why
in fact, let's talk about Rwanda. The Rwanda example. Tell us about the Rwanda example and why aren't more countries towing that line?
Rwanda decided to entrench the common heritages on its own developmental pedestal. Rwanda decided to cut away from the thinking of dependency. Other African countries are dependent upon America, United States, Britain, and other countries for loans, for assistance, for aids, for all those kind of things. President, what is his name of Rwanda, they decided to cut off from all those things, decided to use indigenous level of its own development, instilling the feel of Rwanda in the minds of every citizen first. But Nigerians have to take the stake of the country first. Most of the leaders do not even have the stake of the country first. We have leaders that are thinking of themselves over and above the thinking of the country. Leaders that do not know that leadership is all about trust. Leaders that do not even know what it takes or do not have predetermined agenda of what they should come to do while in office. Leaders that find it difficult to evolve and get competent lieutenants rather than thinking of.
This is my exact concern. That we have people who are negotiating, not everyone. A lot of the people who are negotiating on behalf of
most of them are surrogates of Western imperialism.
This is why I'm concerned and not so excited. But in rounding up, we're out of time in our very interesting conversation today again. But could you just, in rounding up, your final thoughts, talking to African leadership and talking for us Africans?
My final thought is African leaders should think inwards. African leaders should own Africa. They should entrench African interests and aspirations in their mind over and above their selfish interests. And they should think of relationship with countries that are at the peer level of our own development. Countries like Brazil, countries like Pakistan, countries like India. These are the countries that Africa should be thinking of developmental partnership with. Not countries that are far, far away from you. Not countries that are looking upon your resources behind every advancement of assistance they are giving you.
Thank you very much. All right, it's been a pleasure talking with you, Dr. Mainasara, and we hope we'll continue this conversation again.